When you think of West Coast rap today, you're probably thinking of the likes such as Kendrick Lamar, DJ Mustard, Dr. Dre, the late Nipsey Hussle, and many other rappers from California that embody that West Coast sound we all know and love. So today we're going to look at how that sound came to be by focusing on key cultural shifts in hip hop as it evolved through time. Back in the mid-80s, nightclub owner Alonzo Williams was one of the founding fathers of hip-hop with his nightclub The Eve After Dark.
I want you to keep these fat asses shaking. Don't play none of that street-ass rap shit, alright? I want these motherfuckers to think about pussy, not pistols.
Opened in 1979, The Eve After Dark brought the art of DJing to the West Coast, with DJs at the time mixing the instrumental breaks of hard-edged electro-funk instrumentals, mixing just the instrumental breaks from one record after the other, encouraging clubgoers to keep dancing and maintain a high energy. This DJing style in itself was pioneered by DJ Kool Herc within the Bronx in 1973 at his DJ Herc block parties, and many consider him to be the founding father of hip-hop as he pioneered DJing instrumental breaks, which the West Coast ultimately adopted. On top of chopping instrumental breaks, other DJing techniques also became established, such as scratching, backspinning, cutting, and many more. Scratching in particular is when a DJ physically moves the record back and forth to create a rhythmic element, and was shown by New York DJ Davey DMX to founding members of NWA, DJ Yella and Dr. Dre at the Eve After Dark nightclub, where Dre and Yella were regular DJs. Now keep in mind this would have been in the mid-80s, well before the establishment of NWA. However, Dre and DJ Yella were still pivotal during this founding era of West Coast hip hop, as they were involved with producing tracks for the electro-funk group World Class Wrecking Crew, the group that Eazy-E notoriously dissed Dr. Dre for being a part of on his diss track towards him. Now, listening back to the records created by the World Class Wrecking Crew, you can definitely hear that DJ influence when Dre would be cooking up beats, but at the end of the day, this didn't really do much for rapping and instead focused more towards electro-funk. Yet regardless, the sound would have still been pretty unique to people listening to it at the time, and it gave Dre more tools to work with and innovate, as he'd later go on to shape that signature West Coast sound we all know and love. So, turns out that LA gangster rap did actually exist before NWA, as you had artists like Ice-T, who many consider to be the godfather of rap on the West Coast, talking about themes typically covered in gangster rap. Now, Ice-T did come up from that same electro-funk inspired hip-hop era in the mid-80s, but it was in 1986 where we'd really start to see his impact on the culture through the release of the song 6 in the Morning. This track consisted of themes surrounding street crime, gang activity, drugs and alcohol, and would be written by Ice-T himself from a first-person storytelling format, describing himself as a sort of LA gangster, shedding light on the chaotic environment he was subjected to within LA at the time. But most importantly, Ice-T wasn't just making music for people to vibe and dance to, and rather he was actually making music about the harsh realities of street life that wouldn't have been really common to hear amongst mainstream crowds back then. He'd even go on to make songs that were more socially and politically conscious, talking about police brutality and the rise of street gang activity that would later go on to inspire rappers in the future to speak on similar subject matters. Notably, he was also on the soundtrack of Colors, a movie that came out in 1988 about the Crips and Bloods gang war in LA, visually depicting the subject matters that Ice-T would rap about and showing the cold and harsh reality of youth crime in LA.
So rather than glorifying violence, what I hear you saying is that you're trying to reflect a certain kind of reality.
That's all there is to reflect. You know, I'm a realist. There's no angle. It's just real.
And then production-wise, you could definitely hear that early New York style of instrumentals consisting of mostly a drum pattern along with a simple melody. However, that would all change as we're going to take it back to NWA and Dr. Dre more specifically, where we'd begin to hear Dre's signature production style begin to develop on a worldwide stage. Alright, now we're getting into familiar territory. NWA, made up of Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, MC Ren and DJ Yella, are probably the most iconic LA-based rap group of all time, placing gangsta rap on a worldwide stage. As you had Dr. Dre and DJ Yella coming together to create hard-hitting drum beats mixed with their signature production/DJing styles that was developed from their world-class Wrecking Crew days. This topped with Ice Cube and MC Ren's aggressive storytelling about life on the streets of Compton, and then you can't forget Eazy-E, who added another element of the gritty street life to the group. NWA were also no stranger to controversy, as many of you may know their hit song F the Police that they were banned from playing at live shows and got arrested for performing at a concert. This would have been a defining moment in the group's career, as their social commentary was so impactful, law enforcement felt the need to become directly involved in stopping the music, exemplifying NWA's potential over the youth and to hip-hop culture at the time. And so this shift in culture would have allowed further artists to more openly discuss aggressive and violent subject matters without the need to feel concerned with offending certain groups of listeners at the time, as it became more accepted in the mainstream and was therefore rapped about other gangster rappers that came after NWA. And now focusing on Dre's production, he'd not only include drum breaks and DJ scratches in his beats, but rather fully incorporate samples, mostly from the late 60s and 70s soul records, sampling anything from drums, vocals, guitar riffs, sound effects, and more. You'd even start to hear Dre sample wavering synths from 70s funk bands on tracks such as Dope Boy, which is especially important as this would go on to shape the sound that he'd create called G-Funk on his first solo album, The Chronic. The Chronic, released under Death Row Records, kickstarted Dre's career as a solo producer, working with West Coast rappers and defining its sound. Here, we'd see rappers such as Snoop Dogg work with Dre to create some of their most recognizable tracks like Nothing But a G-Thang, which went 3 times platinum, meaning it sold over 3 million copies, most of which would have been physical CD sales as this was in the 90s. Throughout the album, we'd hear all the signature sounds that Dre developed in his world-class Wrecking Crew and NWA days, through the use of more wavering synth samples from the 70s, defining that G-Funk sound. This signified another shift in West Coast rap, as G-Funk differs from ordinary gangster rap, containing a more slow, mellow sound, but still containing similar lyrical content, rapping about street life on the West Coast. This style of rapping was also more varied than original gangster rap, as you'd hear a lot more melodic singing over hooks, with artists like Snoop Dogg rapping in his signature laid-back style. Snoop in particular was key when making this project, and he would go on to further cement the G-Funk sound with his debut album Doggy Style, pushing the West Coast scene even further.
I make money, and I really don't love hoes. To tell you the truth, I swoop in the coop. I used to love... Man, come on, man, quit playing with me, That was all a freestyle, just going in that motherfucker and just spit from the dome, and it just came out, and Dr. Dre just made it work. Made it work.
You'd even get to hear a bit of Warren G on the intro of These Nuts, another pivotal rapper from the G-Funk era. And so, this era of West Coast rap really set the foundation for what we'd hear over the 90s, with Dre working on the biggest songs and projects released on the West Coast throughout that decade, such as the likes of Tupac Shakur, and later on showcased Eminem to the world on his Slim Shady LP and on Dre's second album, 2001. But after dropping his second album, that would be it for Dre in terms of big solo projects, as he switched his focus to executive producing and supporting upcoming artists that he could sign to his label, Aftermath Records. And with Dre's absence, the G-Funk era naturally came to an end, as fans gravitated towards new sounds being developed by up-and-coming rappers from other areas in the United States. And unfortunately, this resulted in a dry spell for upcoming West Coast rappers as they struggled to break into the mainstream. However, this would all change in the mid-2000s when Dr. Dre would discover the next big rapper from the West Coast, an artist who went by the name The Game. Now, despite The Game today being perceived as an attention-seeking old head with the countless amount of beefs he's been involved in, back in the early 2000s he actually revived the West Coast scene after a short drought of seeing no new big artists emerge. And so The Game decided he wanted to become a rapper after coming out of a coma from being shot in the chest in 2001, and in 2004 he'd get the attention of Dr. Dre, showing him a demo tape that would get him signed to Dre's label, Aftermath Records.
And the only rapper stood out to me was that dude, The Game.
Out of
400 people in this room, I said, this dude right here, this him for us on the West Coast for whatever reason. It just, in my mind, And it came true.
From here, through connections with Interscope, the game would link up with 50 Cent and become a member of G-Unit, in which he'd do his first feature with fellow G-Unit member Lloyd Banks on the track When the Chips Are Down. This track introduced fans to Dr. Dre's new upcoming artist from Compton, in which the game would heavily rep through his lyrics, talking about that dangerous LA street life he was a part of and getting shot in the chest. This would be coupled with the G-Unit style of production popularized by 50 Cent, in which Dre would help craft, and so this was a breath of fresh air for the West Coast scene and generated a lot of buzz around the game's name, leaving fans wanting to hear more, in which they got with another G-Unit feature, and then he began releasing singles for his debut album The Documentary, with the first track being West Side Story featuring 50 Cent. This track definitely cemented the game as the next big star from the West Coast, as he had support from one of the biggest rappers and producers at the time, rapping about the LA street life over G-Unit beats in which fans were familiar with. The game would ultimately go on to release The Documentary, which would be his most successful project to date, with features from a lot of big name artists like Eminem, Mary J. Blige, Nate Dogg, and Busta Rhymes. On top of that, he worked with producers like Dre, Timbaland, and Just Blaze, and so the game couldn't have had a better start to his rap career with a bunch of industry support and bringing life back to the West Coast rap scene. And so it kinda sucks that he ruined his relationship with several artists that help him get to the top, including Dre and more notably 50 Cent. Also, he was not only sabotaging his own career, but he also ruined the momentum that he generated for the West Coast, as he never ended up using his fame or notoriety to put on any other potential West Coast rappers. And so we had to wait a couple more years before we'd see another shift in culture that would put LA rap back in the mainstream, from the likes of new artists that would be able to adopt a new sound for modern West Coast rap. So some of you may be familiar with the passing of torch moment that occurred between Snoop Dogg and Kendrick Lamar live on stage.
I'ma say this and I'ma mean this. Nigga, you got the torch, nigga, you better run with that.
This was Snoop basically telling Kendrick to be a force of good and inspire a new generation of West Coast artists unlike his predecessors, which is ironic because the game was also on stage at that same show trying to lil bro Kendrick. But anyways, it was clear that this is what the West Coast needed after another drought of upcoming artists, while other regions such as the East and the South carried. So to capitalize on the opportunity to be the face of modern West Coast rap, while simultaneously lifting the culture of hip-hop to higher standards, Kendrick would go on to release his coming-of-age album Good Kid, Mad City, in which he'd cover the harsh realities he was subjected to whilst growing up in Compton. The sound of the album naturally contained some of that old West Coast influence from the 90s, as several West Coast producers were involved with making the project, including Dre as an executive producer. And so, for example, the producers would have naturally adopted sampling techniques developed by Dre and past producers. However, the production style across the album is quite diverse, as the beats match Kendrick's energy depending on what point he'd be at when telling the story of Good Kid, Mad City. As for more braggadocious, aggressive records, Kendrick would opt for harder hitting melodies with tough drum beats, whereas for deeper storytelling records, we'd hear simple string, guitar, or light synth melodies, giving those songs a more introspective, eerie feeling as Kendrick expresses the deep struggles of growing up within a troubled environment. There's honestly so much more I could talk about this album, but overall, it's fair to say that the West Coast was in safe hands from this era onwards, as Kendrick maintained his spot as the biggest West Coast rapper and supported countless others alongside him, such as the group TDE. And thankfully, there was no longer a need for the West Coast scene to ever be revived again, as it became so big with rappers coming all over the West Coast and breaking into the mainstream, which brings us to today. So the catalyst for this video basically came from the amount of West Coast rappers that dropped in 2024, like Kendrick, Tyler, Schoolboy Q, Absol, Vince Staples, and more. I think the Kendrick and Drake beef also likely brought a lot more relevancy to these West Coast projects, as Not Like Us and the Kendrick pop-up show brought a lot of attention to the scene, comparable to the buzz generated back in the 90s. And with Kendrick and Tyler both doing large tours in 2025, and Tyler recently remixing Kendrick's Hey Now off of GNX, it looks like the West Coast scene will continue to be at the forefront of hip-hop and will be just as big, if not bigger, than its southern and eastern counterparts for the foreseeable future.